When one considers the shadows that have long fallen across the pages of political history, few concepts evoke as much fascination and dread as tyranny and dictatorship. Though often used interchangeably, these words carry distinct meanings and histories that have shaped the destinies of nations and the lives of countless individuals. Understanding them requires a journey not only through the corridors of power, but also deep into the philosophical and historical roots from which they emerged. Tyranny, at its core, is the abuse of power within any political structure. It is less about the form of government and more about the manner in which authority is exercised. A tyrant is not simply a ruler, but one who misuses their position, ruling oppressively and often for personal gain rather than the common good. The ancient Greeks, who first wrestled with the concept, saw tyranny primarily as a character flaw, a deviation from the virtues expected of a just leader. Aristotle, for example, viewed tyranny as a corruption of monarchy. The tyrant was a monarch who ruled not for the benefit of the people, but solely for himself. In this view, tyranny was defined not by how power was acquired, but by how it was wielded. Over time, Greek thinkers identified several kinds of tyrants, but all shared the common thread of oppressive rule and disregard for the public interest. The Romans inherited and transformed these ideas, shifting the focus from the character of the ruler to the structure of authority itself. The Roman dictator was a constitutional office, appointed during times of crisis to wield extraordinary but legally defined powers. Unlike the Greek tyrant, the Roman dictator's tenure was temporary, bound by law and custom. This was, in a sense, temporary tyranny by consent, a recognition that, at certain moments, the survival of the state required the concentration of power in a single pair of hands. Over centuries, however, the distinction between temporary dictatorship and permanent despotism blurred. As the old republic gave way to imperial rule, the term dictator itself began to lose its constitutional connotations, becoming instead a byword for absolute authority. As history marched forward, the language of power evolved alongside political reality. The decline of monarchies and the rise of modern states in the 19th and 20th centuries brought new forms of concentrated authority. The word dictator rose to prominence as monarchies waned, coming to describe rulers who, regardless of title, held all meaningful power in their grasp. In this modern sense, a dictator is defined by unrestricted authority, a single individual or a small clique who control the levers of government, often emerging from coups or crises. Such regimes are marked by the suppression of dissent, manipulation of state structures, and a near-total intolerance for opposition. Despite these evolving terms, the essential difference between tyranny and dictatorship remains. Tyranny is fundamentally about the abuse of power, regardless of the system, while dictatorship describes the structural reality of one person or group holding absolute sway. In many cases, a tyrant is essentially a dictator, their distinction marked only by the duration of their rule or the degree to which they misuse their authority. The Greco-Roman synthesis captured this nuance, describing dictatorship as temporary tyranny by consent and the tyrant as a permanent dictator. Yet, as political thought advanced, new vocabulary emerged to capture the complexity of such regimes. The 20th century, with its tragic parade of authoritarian governments, saw dictatorship and authoritarianism gradually supplant tyranny as the preferred terms to describe governments where power was abused and concentrated. The roots of absolute rule, however, reach even deeper into the soil of political philosophy and history. Absolutism, another term that often shadows discussions of tyranny and dictatorship, refers to a political system in which unlimited, centralized authority is vested in a single figure, usually a monarch or dictator. The age of absolutism in Europe, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, offers a vivid tableau of how power can be consolidated. Monarchs such as Louis XIV of France, who famously declared, "L'État, c'est moi, I am the state," exemplified the theory of monarchical absolutism. Their authority was justified by the doctrine of the divine right of kings, which held that rulers derived their legitimacy directly from God and were thus answerable only to the divine will. This marked a profound shift from the fragmented feudal order that had previously prevailed across Europe, as kings gathered the reins of power into their own hands and marginalized competing centers of authority. Philosophers and political theorists of the era debated both the necessity and the dangers of absolutism. Some argued that centralized power was essential to maintain order and prevent chaos, while others warned that unchecked authority inevitably led to oppression and the stifling of liberty. The extent to which European monarchs achieved true absolutism remains a subject of debate among historians. In practice, even the most powerful rulers were often constrained by local customs, entrenched interests, and the practical limits of state administration. As the centuries passed, the language of power continued to adapt. Where once tyranny sufficed to describe the oppressive misuse of authority, the rise of constitutional government and the spread of Enlightenment ideals forced a reconsideration of what constituted legitimate rule. The Enlightenment, in fact, is widely seen as the first true alternative to dictatorship as the default mode of governance. Thinkers and reformers of this period challenged the notion that power should be concentrated in the hands of the few, advocating instead for checks and balances, the rule of law, and the protection of individual rights. Yet, as history has often shown, the temptation to centralize authority has proved enduring. Modern dictatorships have emerged in various forms: military juntas, one-party states, personalist regimes, each drawing on the legacy of both ancient tyranny and the structural innovations of the Roman dictatorship. These governments are typically characterized by the concentration of political power, suppression of opposition, and a tendency to manipulate or bypass legal and institutional constraints. Dictators, authoritarians, and tyrants can be distinguished, in part, by their tolerance or lack thereof for dissent and the degree to which they allow any challenge to their rule. It is worth noting that, from a broad historical perspective, dictatorship has often been the default governmental condition. For much of human history, societies have been ruled by those who held nearly all power, whether by force, custom, or divine sanction. Only in recent centuries, and particularly following the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, have meaningful alternatives to absolute rule become widespread. In tracing the evolution of tyranny and dictatorship, one sees not only the shifting vocabulary of power, but also the persistent human struggle to define the boundaries of legitimate authority. Whether cloaked in the robes of monarchy, the uniform of a general, or the rhetoric of popular sovereignty, the specter of absolute rule has haunted civilizations across time and space. Each generation, it seems, must grapple anew with the dangers and allure of concentrated power, seeking ways to guard against its inevitable abuses. As we continue to examine the legacies of tyrants and dictators, it is crucial to remember that these are not mere relics of a distant past. The forces that give rise to oppression and unchecked authority remain with us, demanding vigilance, understanding, and a deep appreciation for the hard-won lessons of history. Only by understanding the shadows cast by tyranny and dictatorship can we hope to recognize and resist them in our own time. History rarely moves in a straight line, and the ascent of tyrants and dictators is seldom the result of a single dramatic event. Instead, the rise to power is shaped by a web of political, social, and psychological conditions that converge to open pathways for absolute rule. Across centuries and continents, familiar patterns emerge: democratic institutions undermined from within, charismatic individuals exploiting crises for personal gain, and societies swept up by currents of fear, hope, or desperation. To understand how tyrants and dictators seize control, we must look beyond caricatures of evil geniuses or cunning usurpers and examine the deeper forces that make such figures possible and sometimes even welcome. For much of human history, empires and kingdoms ruled under the iron grip of dictatorships. This was the norm, not the exception. Democracy, as many scholars note, is a relatively recent and fragile development. It is important to remember that even prosperous, educated societies have proved vulnerable to the sudden emergence of dictatorship, sometimes in places where democratic systems were thought to be strongest. The belief that economic development or social progress immunizes a nation against tyranny is simply not supported by history. Dictatorships have often arisen unexpectedly, exploiting cracks in the political order that were invisible to most until it was too late. The conditions that allow tyrants to seize power are as varied as the societies in which they appear, but certain warning signs recur with unsettling frequency. In democracies, the earliest hints are often subtle: leaders who exaggerate the scale of their electoral mandate, claiming a sweeping popular will that justifies bending or breaking established rules, efforts to restrict voting, undermine independent courts, or sideline the press, a steady erosion of norms, cloaked in the language of reform or necessity. These warning signs are not always easy to distinguish from legitimate political maneuvering, especially when wrapped in patriotic rhetoric. The process is often incremental, a series of small steps, each defensible on its own, that together transform the nature of governance. There are many routes to power, but several broad patterns emerge from the study of history. Some dictators rise through violence, military coups that sweep aside existing authorities, or revolutions that promise liberation but deliver new forms of oppression. Others ascend more subtly, manipulating the levers of democracy itself. They enter the public arena as reformers or saviors, only to subvert the system from within. Once in power, these leaders moved swiftly to consolidate their grip, rewriting constitutions, purging rivals, and reorienting institutions to serve their interests alone. Consider Adolf Hitler's rise in Germany, a textbook example of how democratic mechanisms can be warped to empower a tyrant. Exploiting the chaos of the Weimar Republic, Hitler and the Nazi Party leveraged economic despair, political fragmentation, and public anxiety to gain a foothold. Their message was tailored to the moment, a promise of national renewal, order, and strength at a time when many Germans felt betrayed by their leaders and beset on all sides. The Nazis' electoral successes were not absolute, but they were sufficient to claim legitimacy. Once inside the halls of power, Hitler moved quickly, using legal procedures to dissolve opposition, silence critics, and dismantle the very democracy that had enabled his ascent. The crisis, economic, political, and psychological, became the crucible in which dictatorship was forged. This pattern, crisis exploited by a charismatic figure, is not unique to Germany. In the 20th century, a wave of dictatorship swept across Europe and Asia, each arising from a distinct blend of crisis, nationalism, and militarism. In Italy and Japan, as in Germany, faltering economies, wounded national pride, and fears of social upheaval created fertile ground for authoritarian promises. Leaders like Mussolini and the Japanese militarists harnessed public longing for stability and greatness, channeling it into support for ever more centralized, unchecked rule. Not all dictators come to power through dramatic upheaval or popular acclaim. Some ascend through the patient manipulation of existing structures, exploiting factionalism, neutralizing rivals, and cultivating the appearance of normalcy. The process can be so gradual that by the time the public realizes what has happened, the old order has vanished. Modern scholars have developed tools, such as the so-called Tyranny tracker, to classify regimes and monitor the subtle erosion of democracy into authoritarianism. These studies reveal that executive-led transitions toward dictatorship are often marked by the slow, almost invisible dismantling of institutional safeguards. Charisma plays a central role in this story. While democratic societies may prize competent, relatable leaders, dictatorships often elevate figures whose magnetism verges on the theatrical. The cult of personality becomes a tool of governance, binding the leader to the people through pageantry, propaganda, and ritualized displays of loyalty. Figures like Stalin, Mao, and Kim Jong-un have relied not only on terror, but on carefully crafted images of infallibility and paternal care. The dictator is recast as the embodiment of the nation, the father or savior whose wisdom and strength are beyond question. This charisma is not always inherent. It is manufactured, amplified by state propaganda and the silencing of dissenting voices. Propaganda, indeed, is a weapon as powerful as any army. Tyrants flood the public sphere with carefully curated narratives, turning history, culture, and even language into instruments of control. Alternative viewpoints are ridiculed or suppressed, information is monopolized, and truth becomes whatever the leader declares it to be. This manipulation is especially effective in times of uncertainty, when people crave simple answers and reassurance. When fear and hope are entwined, the promise of order can seem irresistible, even when it comes at the cost of freedom. Yet, as historians emphasize, the rise of dictatorship is never solely the result of individual ambition. Political climates matter. The breakdown of traditional parties, the erosion of trust in institutions, and the polarization of society create conditions in which extraordinary measures seem reasonable, even necessary. In such moments, the boundaries between reform and repression, between leadership and domination, blur. The dictator offers not merely solutions, but a vision, a story in which the nation is redeemed through strength and unity. Meanwhile, the cost of dissent rises steadily, as those who resist are first marginalized, then criminalized, and finally erased. Once power is secured, compromise becomes unnecessary. Dictators, unlike elected leaders and functioning democracies, are not forced to negotiate with rivals or submit to the verdict of the electorate. Instead, they often intensify oppression, using surveillance, purges, and terror to eliminate actual and imagined threats. The machinery of the state is repurposed to serve the interests of the few, with devastating consequences for the many. The societal costs measured in suffering, lost opportunity, and shattered lives are profound and enduring. International efforts to end tyranny have met with mixed success. While some authoritarian regimes eventually collapse under their own weight or in the face of external pressure, others prove remarkably resilient. Scholars continue to study the breakdown of dictatorships, searching for patterns and warning signs that might help societies defend themselves. What is clear is that the pathways to dictatorship are not always obvious, and the dangers are real even in places where democratic traditions seem strong. Looking back across history from ancient tyrants to the infamous dictators of the modern age, the same patterns repeat. Ruthless leaders exploit moments of weakness, skillfully manipulating institutions, ideas, and emotions to claim and hold power. The methods evolve, but the underlying dynamics, crisis, charisma, and manipulation remain stubbornly familiar. The lesson is as cautionary as it is urgent. Vigilance, strong institutions, and an informed public are the only reliable safeguards against the ever-present shadow of tyranny. To understand how tyrants and dictators maintain their grip on power, one must first appreciate the vast machinery of control they assemble and deploy. The tools of their dominance are as varied as they are chilling: censorship, surveillance, purges, propaganda, and the relentless cultivation of personality cults. These are not merely instruments of policy. They become the very environment in which millions live, shaping minds, relationships, and even the most private thoughts. At the core of dictatorial rule lies a system of hierarchical obedience, enforced through repression and co-optation. The dictator's authority flows downward, with each level of society bound to the one above by fear, loyalty, or the hope of reward. This structure is not sustained by brute force alone. Legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it, must be manufactured and maintained. The dictator and his inner circle use propaganda, stage-managed rituals, and sometimes even controlled elections to create the illusion of mass consent. In some regimes, the manipulation is so sophisticated that citizens may believe they possess real choices, even as the outcome is predetermined. This psychological sleight of hand fosters a sense of participation, blurring the line between consent and coercion. Propaganda is omnipresent in the world of the dictator. It is not simply a tool for convincing the public of a leader's greatness or the righteousness of his cause. It becomes an institutionalized system, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Fascist regimes, for example, developed entire bureaucracies dedicated to producing and disseminating propaganda, ensuring that the regime's narrative saturates every corner of society. This is not unique to any one region or ideology. Around the world, autocratic propaganda adapts to local circumstances but always serves the same fundamental purpose: to sustain belief in the regime, to drown out dissent, and to project the image of a leader who is wise, indispensable, and infallible. Yet propaganda must be balanced with repression. Scholars distinguish between regimes that rely on terror and those that prefer a subtler mix of manipulation and coercion. In totalitarian systems, propaganda and violence are tightly interwoven, while so-called spin dictatorships rely more heavily on curated narratives and the management of public opinion. Still, in every case, the aim is to close off alternatives, to make the citizen's imagination shrink to fit the boundaries set by the regime. Censorship is an essential pillar of this architecture. In Spain under Franco, censorship was painstakingly enforced. Newspapers, books, plays, and films were scrutinized, with anything that hinted at dissent or challenged the official narrative swiftly suppressed. The effect was not only to silence critics, but to create a culture of self-censorship, where writers, artists, and ordinary people learned to police their own thoughts and words. In South America, too, the history of censorship stretches from the era of the Incas, who controlled information as a matter of statecraft, to the 20th century military dictatorships that banned books, muzzled the press, and drove artists underground. Brazil's military regime went so far as to create blacklists of writers and musicians, ensuring that the cultural conversation was tightly circumscribed. The goal was always the same: to erase undesirable ideas and make the regime's worldview the only permissible reality. But control of information extends beyond culture and art. Dictators have long understood that fear can be amplified by secrecy. Secret archives, clandestine cemeteries, and hidden records serve as both a warning and a shield for the regime. The knowledge that repression is happening somewhere, to someone, is enough to foster an atmosphere of anxiety and uncertainty, even among those not yet personally affected. This system of secret repression ensures that the machinery of control is ever present but often invisible, its reach extending far beyond visible acts of violence. In the modern era, surveillance has become the cutting edge of dictatorial control. Where once informers and secret police served as the regime's eyes and ears, now digital technologies allow for unprecedented monitoring of citizens. China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea have all deployed sophisticated systems for tracking online activity, monitoring communications, and building detailed profiles of individuals. Artificial intelligence is increasingly used in China to police public spaces, analyze social media, and even predict potential acts of dissent before they occur. These technologies do not merely punish opposition, they aim to make it impossible. The knowledge that one is always being watched encourages self-censorship and conformity, stifling even the thought of resistance. The rise of surveillance capitalism and the weakness of privacy protections further empower authoritarian states. In societies where digital data is easily accessible to the government, dissent can be identified and neutralized before it ever reaches the public sphere. This digital authoritarianism marks a new phase in the evolution of oppression, where the tools of everyday life, phones, computers, apps become instruments of social control. In China, for example, extensive digital surveillance has not only suppressed dissent, but also reshaped welfare programs and patterns of civic participation, blurring the line between social management and political repression. Purges are another hallmark of dictatorial rule, serving both to eliminate rivals and to instill fear among those who remain. These purges are not always violent. Sometimes, the mere threat of removal or exile is enough to secure obedience. Dictators periodically sweep through the ranks of the elite, imprisoning, exiling, or executing those suspected of disloyalty. This logic of autocratic purges ensures that no one's position is ever secure, binding the survival of the elite to the will of the ruler. In the most extreme cases, as during Stalin's Great Purge, paranoia fuels waves of violence, forced expulsions, and even famine. The result is a society gripped by suspicion, where trust becomes dangerous and solidarity nearly impossible. At the heart of many dictatorships lies the cult of personality, a manufactured aura of charisma and infallibility that binds the leader to the people. This is not mere popularity, but a carefully constructed phenomenon, employing parades, portraits, speeches, and rituals to elevate the ruler above ordinary mortals. The cult of personality draws on deep psychological needs for order and stability, but it also demands constant performance from the leader and relentless participation from the public. Sociologists, building on Max Weber's idea of charismatic authority, distinguish between admiration for a leader and the total, quasi-religious devotion seen in personality cults. In such regimes, criticism is not just a political act but a kind of heresy, punishable by ostracism, imprisonment, or worse. The psychological toll of living under such regimes is profound. Studies have found that dictatorship induces self-censorship, identity splitting, and what some call the architecture of fear. People learn to wear masks to hide their true beliefs, to navigate the shifting currents of what is safe to say and what is not. Over time, this produces internalized oppression, a state in which individuals police themselves and, in some cases, come to believe the regime's lies. The trauma does not end with the fall of the dictator. It echoes down generations, shaping attitudes and beliefs long after the regime itself has disappeared. Comparative research on communist and military dictatorships reveals that oppression is not uniform. The methods and intensity of control may vary, but the consequences are strikingly similar: the erosion of trust, the fragmentation of communities, and the steady narrowing of what is imaginable or sayable. Dictatorships, autocracies, and other forms of oppressive government all share this drive to dominate not only the public sphere, but also the inner lives of citizens. The legacy of dictatorship is not easily erased. Evidence suggests that exposure to non-democratic regimes, especially during formative years, reduces preference for democracy and undermines democratic values. The effects linger, shaping political beliefs and behaviors for decades. In this way, the reign of fear does not end at the dictator's death or the regime's collapse. It persists in memory, habit, and the subtle contours of society. The reigns of fear that define dictatorial rule are thus multifaceted and deeply embedded. They are not simply imposed from above, but become a way of life, shaping societies in ways both visible and invisible. The machinery of oppression, censorship, surveillance, purges, propaganda, and personality cult ensures that resistance is costly and conformity is rewarded, leaving a legacy that endures long after the banners and statues have crumbled. The story of tyranny is never solely about those who seize and wield power. It is also about those who resist, endure, and ultimately remember. The downfall of despotic rulers is rarely a single, dramatic event. More often, it is the slow accumulation of courage, the quiet persistence of ordinary people, and the collective refusal to forget that finally brings an end to oppression. History from the 20th century onward offers not just cautionary tales, but a repertoire of hard-won lessons, 20 at least, according to one source, on how to fight tyranny, drawn directly from the lived experiences of those who faced the century's most formidable dictators. These lessons are not abstract principles, but practical guidance forged in times of danger. Defend institutions, beware the normalization of the unacceptable, and commit to truth when lies are wielded as weapons. Yet it is in the aftermath of dictatorship that the most delicate and enduring work begins. When a regime built on terror and personality cults collapses, a society is left with more than just physical ruins. The psychological manipulation that underpins such regimes, often mirroring the dynamics of cult leadership, leaves deep scars. The traits that make cult leaders effective, charisma, manipulation, and a demand for absolute loyalty, do not disappear with their fall. Instead, their influence lingers in the collective psyche, shaping habits of thought and patterns of trust or fear that affect the next generation. The abuses that occur in political cults and closed societies, exploitation, coercion, the systematic breaking of individual will, can have effects as profound as those documented in religious or social cults. Just as children raised in cults often struggle with trauma and identity in the aftermath, so too do societies wrestle with the long-term effects of indoctrination and surveillance, especially when oppression has been a daily reality for decades. The pain is not abstract. In the wake of dictatorship, survivors confront trauma that is sometimes invisible but always real. For children who grow up knowing only the world of a closed, repressive regime, the process of recovery is fraught with confusion and loss. They must learn to trust again, to distinguish truth from propaganda, and to participate fully in a society that may itself be uncertain about its newfound freedoms. The psychological toll can persist for generations, affecting how societies rebuild, form new identities, and remember the past. Despite these challenges, history is filled with examples of successful resistance, often nonviolent, sometimes against overwhelming odds. The power of civil resistance has been demonstrated time and again. Campaigns relying on mass mobilization, strikes, boycotts, and symbolic acts have overthrown entrenched dictatorships without resorting to violence. The record is global. In the Dominican Republic, the 14th of June movement became a beacon of opposition to Rafael Trujillo's brutal regime, mobilizing both men and women in clandestine efforts that eventually helped topple the dictatorship. In South America, the Mothers of the Disappeared, Las Madres de la Plaza de Mayo, transformed grief into protest, marching in silent defiance against Argentina's military dictatorship, demanding answers for their missing children and inspiring others to speak out. These and many other nonviolent campaigns, documented across continents, reaffirm a central truth: even the most formidable systems of repression can be challenged by the sustained courage of organized, peaceful resistance. The aftermath of tyranny brings its own set of dilemmas. Economic growth achieved under autocracies, as some critics argue, often occurs not because of oppression, but despite it. Western aid, intended to foster development, has at times propped up autocratic regimes, inadvertently prolonging their existence. This complicates recovery, as societies must not only rebuild institutions, but also untangle the legacies of foreign support and the distortions in their economies. The transition out of authoritarian rule is rarely smooth. Peaceful outcomes are possible, but never guaranteed. Factors such as the willingness of outgoing elites to negotiate, the presence of a robust civil society, and the availability of impartial justice can determine whether a society moves toward inclusive governance or risks sliding back into violence or renewed repression. Accountability and truth are essential if democratization is to take root. Failing to confront the crimes and abuses of the past can undermine the entire process, leaving old wounds to fester and new conflicts to emerge. Transitional justice, whether through trials, truth commissions, or carefully structured amnesties, aims to balance the demands of justice and reconciliation. The experience of Chile, among others, illustrates both the possibilities and limits of these approaches. While truth commissions can uncover the facts of past atrocities, and trials can hold perpetrators accountable, the process is inevitably fraught with tension. Some victims demand retribution, others seek healing and acknowledgement. The choices societies make about how to remember, judge, and forgive shape not just the present, but generations to come. The global record of transitional justice is mixed. Some mechanisms, like well-designed truth commissions, have contributed to human rights reforms and the strengthening of democracy. Others, particularly blanket amnesties or the absence of any reckoning, have left societies vulnerable to the return of dictatorship. The challenge is to write history in a way that does not reproduce the violence of the past, but instead enables a more honest, inclusive collective memory. This is as much an ethical task as it is a political one. Remembrance is not only a matter of private grief or individual testimony. Societies have developed a rich array of ways to commemorate the victims of state tyranny. The International Memorial Museum's Charter, for example, sets out principles for preserving the memory of those who suffered under oppressive regimes, emphasizing the importance of education and public engagement. Monuments and memorials serve as sites of collective memory, offering spaces where survivors and descendants can mourn, reflect, and bear witness. The act of remembrance is itself a form of resistance against denial, against erasure, against the temptation to forget uncomfortable truths. Institutions like the Victims of Communism, Museum Remembrance Society exist to ensure that the suffering endured under communist regimes is neither minimized nor forgotten. Their mission is both commemorative and educational, seeking to inform the public about the human cost of totalitarian experiments. The ongoing legacy of such regimes, whether communist or otherwise, reminds us that the struggle against tyranny is never truly over. Memory, when cultivated and protected, becomes a safeguard against the repetition of past horrors. Writing history after dictatorship is a particularly sensitive endeavor. There is a real danger that the process of memorialization will be co-opted or sanitized, perpetuating cycles of violence or silencing inconvenient truths. The challenge, as some scholars contend, is to construct narratives that honor victims without inflaming new divisions, to remember without reproducing the logic of oppression. This work is difficult but essential. It is the bridge between what was endured and what can be built anew. The downfall of figures like Mussolini and Hitler, often violent and ignominious, has provided stark lessons in the fate that awaits those who rule by fear. Yet, as religious and philosophical traditions have long observed, the empowerment of the oppressed is not a one-time event but a continuous process. Vigilance against the return of tyranny requires more than just laws or institutions. It requires a sustained commitment to the lessons of history, that freedom is fragile, that the machinery of oppression is always adaptable, and that the price of liberty is, indeed, eternal vigilance. In the end, the legacies of despotism are measured not only in the suffering inflicted, but in the resilience of those who resist and remember. Societies that recover from dictatorship do so by reclaiming their stories, rebuilding their institutions, and forging new bonds of trust, always with an eye to the past, but determined to chart a different future. The lessons learned are both cautionary and hopeful. Tyranny can be resisted, memory can heal, and the struggle for justice and dignity is never in vain.